As we continue in our study of diversity issues, I'd like to talk a little bit about ethnic identification and social identity and the interplay between the two of them. There are many different theories about the interplay of these features of our personality, and it's worth taking a few moments to look at some of the basics concerning this topic. Social identity forms from our tendency to categorize ourselves and compare ourselves to others. Self-categorization involves the labeling we make of ourselves and our tendency to adopt the behaviors and characteristics and values of any particular group that we belong to that are considered to be normal. Now, oftentimes we are engaged in a part of many different groups, and occasionally those values and those behaviors come into conflict with each other. But generally speaking, here we're talking about the larger sense of identity we have in regards to our culture and our ethnic background. Ultimately, these values, these behaviors, these characteristics become internalized. As a result of this internalization, we begin to see ourselves as a part of different groups, and because of that, then a dichotomy of in-group and out-group loyalties begins to develop. Our self-esteem is largely developed through social comparison. First, our personal self-esteem comes from comparing ourselves to other individuals and evaluating how we measure up. That's the interactionalist perspective in sociology, if you remember from your basic sociology course. Our social self-esteem, though, is derived from comparing the groups that we belong to with other social groups, and depending upon what groups we're talking about, whether we're a part of the majority or the minority, those comparisons can be favorable or not. We tend to choose factors that allow us to see ourselves more favorably in comparison to others, and so social hierarchies get established that allow us or provide us with the opportunity to maintain our power and our privilege. We can justify that by seeing others as being inferior to us, whether those others are other groups or other individuals. But because we belong to many different groups, of course, we do develop many different social identities, and so these identities may conflict with each other from time to time. Given this, the development of self-esteem can become very complicated and very difficult. For instance, males experience privilege, but African American males or males of other oppressed racial groups may experience less privilege or lack privilege altogether because of their membership in that group, even though they are male. And so identity becomes much more complex in that light. Groups that are dominant in society control the status quo, unlike the minority groups in that society. And so in order to maintain their power, they will often act to subordinate those other groups. Different kinds of models of adolescence that we have studied in our psychology and human development courses can give us some insight into the development of ethnic identity also. So Erikson's model of identity versus identity confusion, where the adolescent works to achieve some sense of self through resolving different conflicts in regards to the question of who am I? And James Marsh's 4 statuses of identity that's based on the presence or absence of crisis and commitment. And you may recall the matrix where his identity statuses were boiled down to 4 different statuses, identity achievement, foreclosure, diffusion, or moratorium, based upon the presence or absence of crisis or commitment. Taking a look at this, especially this last one, I think is a good model to understand a little bit about the achievement of identity and in the process of moving from one culture to another and determining what to do with one's ethnic identity as well. Dominic Ristoricci looked at a correlation between the emotional separation from the mother country that occurs during acculturation as being similar to the separation from a child's biological mother. That is, the person goes from a process of identifying with the mother or the mother culture, let's say the mother country, then differentiating from that culture in the process of acculturation to the new society. And this process takes time. So there are different ways of kind of looking at that process. The person who is acculturating to a new society must reach some sort of compromise between the different cultural norms of the traditional culture, deciding what to maintain and internalize, while also working to incorporate aspects of the new culture into that person's functioning on a daily basis. So there's a negotiation that goes on between the cultural norms and values from both the traditional and the host cultures as that person goes about the process of trying to establish a cultural identity. And of course, there's going to be a lot of psychological and social conflicts involved in this process for that person, not only between that person and other persons in the family system, let's say, or in the community, but also within the individual himself or herself. In this discussion, we're really distinguishing race and ethnicity here, so that ethnicity, really, we're looking at something much more than racial identity because it includes the cultural and socialization patterns as well. We know that race is a social construct, but the culture of origin and the culture of destination are the things that factor into how important one's racial characteristics may be perceived, so that belonging to a particular racial group in one culture, say the host culture, may not matter at all, whereas in another host culture, it really establishes one's position in the social ladder, so to speak, of that culture. So this really has a lot to do to determine what the racial identity, what role racial identity comes to play in terms of status in the new culture. Jean Finney identified three aspects of ethnicity that account for its psychological importance. One is ethnicity as a minority status, so that really kind of speaks to the absence of power and oftentimes the presence of prejudice and discrimination. The racial stereotypes influence the way we view ethnic group members, but also they can become internalized within the individual, the group members themselves, as we've talked about in previous discussions. Another aspect of ethnicity that's important is ethnicity as culture. That is, the cultural characteristics of the groups, the norms, values, behavior specific to that group or culture that is handed down through the generations. So that's another thing that makes ethnicity very important for the individual. And finally, ethnicity as identity. And the question is, how strongly does that individual relate to and identify with the ethnic group? This has a lot to do with how one labels himself or herself, and feelings of belonging and involvement in activities associated with the group, and so on. Another look at the variables that are important in interpreting and explaining ethnic differences among individuals is Jennifer Alvarez's. She actually identified 5 variables, which first of all is, the minority status of the individual's group. That's an important factor to consider when looking at the impact of ethnicity for your clients. The socioeconomic status of the individual. So an individual who comes from another culture and is struggling to make ends meet is going to have a very different experience in the new culture, the new society, as opposed to one who is gainfully employed and has a comfortable income for himself and herself and their family. How acculturated is that individual and how strongly identified with ethnicity is the individual? That's another factor in understanding the importance of ethnic differences among our clients. What is the immigration history of the individual and the group? If an individual, say for instance, immigrates to the United States in a period of time when the group is warmly received and there's plenty of opportunity to get established in the job market, for instance, it's a very different experience from one where individuals come and they're mistrusted and shunned by the majority culture and compete, say, in a very tight market economy. So not only knowing the culture of origin, the country of origin of the immigrant, but also understanding what was going on in society at the time that that individual or that family came to America has a lot to do with how, the impact of their ethnic status in society. And again, is this a relatively recent immigrant or an immigrant family that's been here for 100 years? And also the cultural factors in the society and in the individual's groups. And of course, an example of a cultural factor in society an example of that is just the general reception we have today, the general resistance we have today for the whole topic of immigration in the United States is not a good time, not a time when groups are warmly received as they come to America. Quite different from other periods of our history, but not unique. Now, there's also a differentiation here in terms of terminology when you look at ethnic identity formation, and it really talks about two processes that have something to do with the development of ethnic identity. First, enculturation, which is the process of ethnic identity development in an individual through observation and instruction. And this is the ethnic socialization that the individual got in the member of their group of origin, let's say their ethnic group of origin. Whereas acculturation, different from enculturation. Acculturation is the process of socialization into an ethnic group other than one's own, while being influenced by various factors in the enculturation process. Racial socialization is what it's referred to here. So enculturation has more to do with the development of ethnic identity within one's own group, and acculturation is acclimating to a new culture. Another model that looks at ethnic identity development is crisis and resolution. And it's a component of the larger process of identity development, kind of like we had referred to earlier when we were talking about Marsh's and Erickson's models. And in this process, one defines the self with respect to values, beliefs, and goals. And there are three premises at the foundation of this particular model. The one is that the idea that the pressure to assimilate can be psychologically stressful. That is, the pressure to blend into the new culture can be very, very stressful psychologically. And a sense of marginality, that is, not having a feeling of belonging to any group in particular, tends to correlate with a psychological maladjustment. And so attachment to a group is an important part of one's a sense of ethnicity, sense of self, and also ethnic pride. That is, I guess this kind of goes hand in hand with the second point, that pride in one's own ethnic identity is connected to greater freedom of choice in the acculturation process. So feeling certain of one's own ethnic identity, it gives the person a sense of confidence and the capacity to be able to pick and choose the kinds of things they want to do or not do in the process of assimilating into a new culture. There are 5 stages in ethnic identity development noted in this model, and I'm not going to go through them one by one here. You can read this slide for yourself, but basically it looks at that process where one examines one's own ethnic belonging and the desire to assimilate or achieve success, and the pressure that's put on that person in order to assimilate so that they can become economically successful, and the conflicts that creates in one's own ethnic identity. And ultimately then the individual works through that and resolves that to the point where the individual is able to have a sense of ethnic pride and accept self, seeing their identity as a positive, or ethnic identity as a positive resource, while also assimilating into the larger culture in a way that enables that person to be successful. Another model of ethnic identity development, and these are different theories and models, all of which may be useful to you as you work with persons from other cultures who are adjusting to life in America, let's say. So this goes back to Finney's model. She developed or identified a 3-stage model of ethnic identity. First, and this sounds a little bit like Marsh's statuses of identity, but the unexamined ethnic identity, where the person really hasn't explored their own identity and really isn't really interested even in their own ethnicity and what it means to them, accept the attitudes of the dominant culture freely, and ethnicity really is sort of a non-issue for them that leads to identity diffusion or foreclosure. In Stage two, the individual is really kind of searching for an ethnic identity. And it perhaps could be that there's some sort of crisis or whatever that forced the individual out of stage one and caused them to begin to explore a little bit about their ethnicity. And that crisis could be something very harsh, like overt racism, as is suggested here, or something less traumatic. But it's a time really where the individual experiments, talking with friends and family, reading literature, taking classes, learning customs and those kinds of things, attending different kinds of cultural events, and eventually, ultimately, then working towards some sort of ethnic identity achievement, where the ethnic identity conflicts are resolved, and the person is able to accept membership in their minority culture, be open to other cultures, and perhaps feel as though they're participating in the larger culture as well. This theory says that the best outcome would be for an individual to have a secure ethnic identity and a positive orientation toward the mainstream culture. That's arguable, but this is the theory associated with this particular model. I once was in a training session where the trainer was talking about individuals. I forget what culture. It might have been Vietnam, the culture they were coming from, and the efforts to help them adjust to life in Alaska. And the trainer said that assimilation really was the preferred pattern of adjustment. It was the best adjustment the individual could make. And even then, and that was many years ago, a lot of us questioned whether or not assimilation was necessarily the best outcome in the process of acculturation. Because remember, assimilation implies the loss of at least to a certain extent, the loss of one's own cultural and ethnic identity. Another matrix that I found that I also liked, and just another one for you to refer to, is the ethnic identity model. This looks at the level of assimilation and the strength of ethnic identity in another matrix. So, the high assimilation, high ethnic identity, my assumption would be here is that this is what this model presumes to be the preferable place in this matrix. That's the upper right quadrant, so that the person can feel assimilated in the majority culture but still retain a strong sense of ethnic identity, have a bicultural perspective in friendship patterns and membership in organizations. It's implying that they're participating in society, but also staying connected in their own communities of origin. Can move back and forth between the majority and minority cultures easily, interested in keeping their ethnic heritage alive and knowledgeable about it, but also, fully participating enough in the larger host culture that they can really serve as a bridge between those two cultures. So that seems to be a pretty positive orientation. And again, you can see the variance in adjustments with different levels of assimilation and ethnic identity in this model. I like this particular matrix. Finally, components of ethnic identity that are most widely studied in the literature on the topic include issues like self-identification. It's something that's considered very important. How does one label the self, especially for those that have mixed ethnic heritage? It's important to understand their ethnic identity completely. How much do they belong? How much do they sense that they belong to their ethnic group? What are their own attitudes towards one ethnic group? Is it positive or negative? Do they accept or reject their ethnic identity? And how engaged are they in their ethnic group and in the cultural and social practices, friendships, groups, and religious affiliation, cultural traditions and practices, those kinds of things? How engaged are they in all of that? These are some things that perhaps can tell you finally, if you're looking at assessing ethnic identity and comfort with that. This is another way of looking at that and assessing that. But none of the models that are represented here in this brief presentation are universal by any stretch of the imagination, but any one of them can provide some basis of knowledge for assessing and intervening and providing some insight for us in our work with individuals from other cultures. So these particular slides may be ones that may be useful to print out and hold on to and refer back to as the semester goes along, as well as in the future in your practice. So that's what I have to say about this, and I hope it's helpful. Thank you.